Hello, fellow ham, CBers, shortwave listeners, and anyone else that may have found our stream. Welcome to you, whether you are in the field, in the shack, or somewhere in between. If you're attending the live stream, we encourage you to drop a question into the chat. If you're watching this as a video post-event and have a question for us, please leave a comment and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. This stream is being broadcast both on my YouTube channel, Outdoors on the Air, and Chris's YouTube channel, Kilo 2 Charlie Juliet Bravo Radio. We don't have a moderator, so we may not get a chance to respond directly to any comments you make during the stream. We'll try our best to get to them all, but if we don't respond directly to your comment, we promise it's nothing personal. Tonight's stream is the latest in our Ham Heroes series. With this series, we profile people who are making a unique and positive contribution to the great hobby of radio. This month, our special guest is Peter Parker, VK3YE. Peter hails all the way from Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Due to the volume of high-quality work he has produced over the years, I consider Peter to be a global ham radio ambassador. We're very fortunate to have him with us. Peter has had a YouTube channel since 2008, named Amateur Radio VK3YE. I've been following Peter's channel for years. He is one of the most creative and capable hams on YouTube, and he never fails to put out thoughtful, intelligent videos. Peter is also an accomplished author, having written a number of ham radio-oriented books. Before we get into the details of Peter's efforts, let's go around the table and see what the crew has been up to. For myself, I've just posted the video of my effort to work the CQ Worldwide Single Sideband DX contest with my Yaesu FT817. That was quite an adventurous weekend, including the failure of my FT897D. Now that winter has set in here, my camping season is over until spring, but I've got a few ham radio projects up my sleeve. I'll start working on those soon. Enough about me. Let's get to my co-host. We'll start with Chris, Kilo 2 Charlie Juliet Bravo. Hey, Chris, what's happening over there with you?
Well, good to see everybody again. Good to be back. It's been a lot's happened actually in the last month since we were we did this. In fact, Tracy mentioned the CQ Worldwide contest, so I operated it, but from the comfort of my home shack here. I didn't go out anywhere, and it was fun actually. The conditions were good, so made quite a few contacts through the week. I didn't operate the whole whatever it is 48 hours of it. I just operated whenever I could. So, but made quite a few contacts. A handful of new countries for me on 10 meters, which was good. 10 was open. It was in pretty good shape. So the treat for me out of that was on Saturday night after I shut the radio down, I was just kind of chilling out with the iPad, and I saw another guy guy from Costa Rica had posted his CQ Worldwide adventure, and sure enough, he had a video of me contacting him. So I was like, well, that's pretty slick. So that was neat. So same as Tracy, it's getting cold here too in Connecticut. So it's time to, the 817 is in its case right now. And I do have a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, made me a set of rails to put on it. I have to do that yet. So, and I've got a couple of projects too. You might see there's a little Tempo 1 sitting over here that needs a set of tubes. So that's one of my winter projects I have to do. So that's what we're up to.
Good stuff. Hey, Tim, what's keeping you busy lately?
Well, it's the holiday season, and I've got lots and lots of things to do. And people are home from various places. And I've been working with the 817 out of the lake house for the past couple of weekends. And that's been fun. There's like a consistent 30-mile-an-hour breeze coming off the lake into the front of the house. So, and there's like one tree, so keeping things going has been kind of a challenge. But I'm using the little random wire that I've got with the half extension. So it's like 35 feet. So basically I could take like the dog toy, throw it up in the tree and bring it down, which is what I did. And that's been working fine. And I don't have my logging software at the cottage. So what I have to do is I have to take the log, email it to myself, and then program it when I'm here at home. So if I've worked you and I haven't confirmed the contact, it takes a little while. I'm lazy. But one thing that did strike me is that if you look at everybody's background and how nice and neat everything is, Tracy's got his all stuff nice and clean, and Chris has got his all, glowing and clean and dusty. And if you look, so this is, if you want to know, if there's a comparison of neatness and what I've got going on, as you can tell. So there's the contrast. But I'm glad to have Peter here tonight.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Hey, and last but certainly not least, Peter, what's going on in your world?
Well, we've just had on Sunday one of our ham fests here in Melbourne, the Rosebud Radio Fest, and came away with a few bargains. Recently did a video of it, so I'm still in the process of going through what I've got back from it and thinking about how I'm going to use it. Am I going to pull whatever I got apart? Will I use the bits? Will I put them in different boxes? And all that sort of thing. So one of the finds was a Frog Sounds QRP rig, a little QRP transceiver. You sometimes see it on eBay for 40 meters. I think I've decided that I might pull that apart. It does have some useful components like crystals, NE602s. Now I've got enough 40 meter QRP rigs anyway. And then there's another unit piece of test equipment called a noise bridge, which are pretty much obsolete these days with everyone having antenna analyzers, but I connected a 9-volt battery to it and got some noise coming out of the receiver. I wasn't able to get it to null at positions where I thought it would be, so that might require a little bit more work in seeing if there's anything wrong with it, or maybe the antenna I've got it connected to was wrong. So still some investigation work there, but yeah, it's one of those days after a ham fest where you've got all this junk and you've got to think, how are you going to use it?
Is that the one? Is that the one you bought? You had the video, right, where you bought that pile of stuff, and was that the noise bridge that you had in there? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes,
Oh,
that was in that video, and there was also a big set of drawers. The cabinet wasn't worth very much by itself, but the contents, all these binding posts and lugs and connectors, which are quite expensive when you buy them individually.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I was like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I found out that I've turned into my father, right? So when I see all this vintage stuff, vintage we call it here. So we find vintage stuff like that. I've got probably 2 or 3 antique multimeters and stuff like that. Yeah, see, that's wonderful, and you don't get that anywhere else that I found,
except if you have hard rubbish collections like we do here, where every year people put rubbish out on the street and the council come and take it. There was the one in a month or two ago. There was an old 1970s TV tuner. I did a video on that, and you could use that tuner as a converter and hear all sorts of VHF signals on it with a receiver connected up to it. So that was also a fun little experiment.
Nice.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I saw that one too. That was great. We don't have see, I can't go dig in other people's trash piles. They might get mad at me here.
And the thing I find at ham fests here in the States is that most of the time, you got to walk around a ham fest here like with a couple $1,000s in your pocket.
Yeah,
you really do. You don't find like some guys will have like a box of just like junk, and you can kind of rifle through it. But you don't find like what you're talking about, where you find like, hey, I found this piece of gear and I can strip it apart and get all sorts of stuff out of it. You don't get that. At least I haven't. In my experience, I haven't really seen a whole lot of that. I usually see guys trying to radios for $2,000.
Yeah, that's very different to here. Like yesterday, you could have bought possibly 50 airspace variable capacitors on various tables. There were just loads and loads and loads of them. If you wanted to make an antenna coupler, I didn't see any vacuum variables, but otherwise, if you wanted to make an antenna coupler or even some types of magnetic loops, you could have got a variable capacitor without any problems.
Sure.
It used to be that you could there used to be like some large flea markets and things like that here in the Chicago area. I know there's a couple of really big ones down in Texas, where you would go and you would find things like that. They would have all their stuff laid on the table, and you could do it pretty cheaply. But that trend has gone away probably for about 10 years now. I think the best option for things like that is to maybe pay attention to like some local estate sales or things like that. If you can find somebody that was, an old ham whose family is, trying to sell some of their stuff, or even like old electricians. There was a small motor shop in town here that was in business. I mean, I remember being, 5 and 10 years old in the car driving by, and there was, so-and-so electric supply and small motors, right? And I drove by a couple of weeks ago, and it's gone now, right? And it's all closed up and it's all shut down. And the first thing I thought of is like, wow, how can I get in there? I bet you there's. I was like, huh? What do I have to call it? And so if there's like a realtor number like for rent that goes up on it or something like that, I'm calling just to see what we got.
Peter, how did you get? Sorry, Tim. Peter, how did you get started in ham radio?
I suppose it started with being fascinated with lights and wires and putting bits and pieces together. Started with batteries, lights, motors. I don't know where I got a motor from, but I did, and made something out of that. It was very, very basic. Like the things that I built would have only had maybe 3 or 4 parts, if that. A lot was dependent on stuff that I was given. At the time, a lot of people were throwing out transistor and valve radios. It was, and because I didn't know much at the time, I would just pull them apart. If I had kept some of them, they would now be vintage type things. But anyway, at the time, just pulled them apart and salvaged the components. We were in the country, so there were no electronic shops nearby. So yeah, just started with simple things: batteries, bulbs, eventually crystal sets. I was given there was Tandy, or your Radio Shack, but yes, we called them Tandy. You had the battery of the month card, the battery of the month card that you'd go in. Or we didn't have a shop near us, but if someone was going into the city, then you'd give them your battery card and you'd get your free 9-volt battery, always 9-volt batteries. That was the most expensive. And there are the Tandy electronics kits, the science fair kits with all the springs. So I had 150 in one. So that was a lot of fun. Then it took me a while to learn how to solder. I was prematurely given a Tandy transistor radio kit, and I never got it to working because it was based on soldering. It was a bit more advanced than I was at for my age. So anyway, that didn't work. So most of the things I built did not work. So a lot of salvaging, messing around with things. Where we were also is we had 2 rubbish tips that were only a short distance away, like a couple of miles from town. So sometimes go on your bike, and these were country town rubbish tips. They were just unattended. All the rubbish was in a pit, so if it had rained, there was all this water in there, and there might be deep dead sheep or cattle because it was a farming area. But anyway, it was sometimes quite smelly, but hopefully, but there are often people were throwing out radios and even TVs, so you could always have a good supply of components from what you could find at the rubbish tip. So none of it needed much money, and you eventually built things out of that. Again, most of them didn't work.
How many of us? Think of this: how many people got into ham radio through those Radio Shack little 150 in one electronics kits? I remember making one of those.
Lots of them.
Right?
And also, in Australia we had, in fact, until very recently, Dick Smith Electronics Funway kits, and they were commercially very smart, because in the case of the Radio Shack kits, you would get your 150 in one project. You'd have your parts, your springs, and your wires, and you could follow the instructions, build the projects, and this was it. Whereas with the Dick Smith Funway kits, you could buy everything separately. So you had a book. There was Funway 1, which was without soldering, and then there was Funway 2 and 3 that had soldering. And you would have these boards and springs. And the business model of that was that you would buy the parts separately from Dick Smith as you built every separate project, because you could get bags with projects for, say, 1 to 10 or 11 to 20. But especially for the more advanced projects, the bags were not complete. You'd always need to buy extra parts because you might join 2 kits together to form, say, a radio transmitter. You might need both the radio frequency oscillator and an audio amplifier, so on 2 boards. So the business model was to keep you going into the shop all the time, buying bits, and no doubt your parents would also be there, possibly even spending even more money on things. So it was a very clever business model that you didn't need much money to start off with, but you were going into the shop all the time to be building these projects. And so you would have a piece of, I used initially a bit of wood that you screwed. You had screws, and then the screws would hold the component leads under. And you had in the back of the book a template, and that template was with a grid of 1 centimeter. So you'd have your screw holes in that grid, and so it would actually tell you where you'd put the parts very precisely. You'd follow that, and hopefully the project would work. So there was no soldering for the first book. So that, and there are things like crystal sets, simple electronic alarms, sound makers, doorbells, those sorts of things. So Dick Smith Electronics was absolutely huge, and they also sold amateur radio gear in Australia. So there was a bit of a progression from starting with those simple kits to getting up to more advanced electronics in the components, the radio, and the computing.
Yeah. There was a company here in the States, Graymark, that made kits. And when I was in high school, I went to a vocational high school, Voctech High School, and they had we built. They're going to show my age now. When I was in high school, we built a 5-tube radio kit, AM radio kit, and we did a very similar thing. We had a piece of plywood, and the teacher just took the schematic, the Graymark schematic, and blew it up. And we all like glued it onto the piece of, each had a piece of plywood. We put little nails in where all the junctions were, and used wires and wired up a 5-tube, which you can imagine actually had 117 volts AC sitting on 2 nails on this piece of plywood.
Yeah. Well, good news is you can still do those sorts of things. Like here in Australia, although Dick Smith closed down, they got into consumer electronics. They went the similar way to Radio Shack. They went into consumer electronics. There was a lot of other competition. The market was bigger with consumer electronics than the specialized bits, but the profit margins were less, and they could make that pay. But we still have a shops called JCar and Altronics in most capital cities, and you can still go there and buy resistors and capacitors over the counter. And JCar also have a series called Short Circuits, which is very similar to the Dick Smith Funway. So you can still, even now, go into those shops and buy parts and buy electronic kits with books and projects. So that's really good.
Yeah. There was somebody else. There's another company that makes. You talk about the modular idea. There is a company, forget the name of it, that makes they're like little perf boards where you build the circuits, and then you can kind of plug them into each other and like put all these circuits together to make some other larger device. I forget the name of the company. But yeah, that's cool.
We have a question, Peter, and you've done a lot of work with wire antennas. I wonder if you want to take a look at this one and see if you have any ideas.
Yeah. Okay. I think I can see the question about adding more gain 1 meter away. I wouldn't go that route. I would look at if you wanted to get more gain out of a wave wire antenna, I would first of all make it a end-fed full wavelength wire antenna, and if you do that, you'll get a bit sharper lobes. You'll get maybe 2 or 3 dB of gain, and that will still be high impedance, being 1 wavelength. You can still feed it at the end, and that's what I've done for. I've done some videos where I've done that and worked Europe quite successfully, and I've oriented that to be broadside. There's a bit of gain. When you make the antenna much longer than that, then the gain splits off into multiple lobes, and the pattern becomes less clean. Another possibility, which may be slightly better, is you still use your 1 wavelength of wire that's end-fed, but you have about a 1/4 wavelength of it vertical. So instead of having 1 pole in the middle, so like an end-fed inverted V, You then have one pole at either end, so it goes up by up by a quarter wavelength, then horizontal for a half wavelength, and then down again for a quarter wavelength. So a total of one wavelength of wire, and that is called a half antenna. And especially if you're in salt water, that's a very good low angle radiator. So that's an excellent DX performer on a band like 10 meters. So that amount of wire, it's 20 meters of wire. So it's just like a quarter on 7 hertz is a full wavelength on 14 megahertz, and with that it will give you gain on 14 megahertz. That's broadside. Another possibility, if you want even more gain, is to make it even wider, and that's called a bobtail curtain, where instead of having 2 quarter wavelength vertical sections, which are effectively vertical antennas, you have 3 of them, and you can feed it either at the bottom, which I prefer because it's easiest mechanically and it's high impedance, so you can use an L-match coupler, or you can feed it in the top middle or top corner. Or for the half square, it's one of the top corners where it's close to 50 ohm, or for the bobtail, it's the top middle. And that will give you even more broadside gain. And I believe that, I haven't done this, if you add reflectors behind it, you can get even more gain, but it does need to be a certain spacing. It needs to be more than a meter. Anyway, I've done a lot of videos on half square and bobtail antennas. So have a look on my website, VK3YE.com, and there's also videos where I've tested it portable.
Okay, good stuff. You know what? Let's get into the slides that we've got here.
So wait a minute.
Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
He's on a balcony, so I don't know how much full wave stuff you're gonna do on 40 meters. Probably 20 though.
Well, for a balcony, you might have to possibly maybe a vertical antenna could be the best, and you can get, at least here in Australia, telescoping fishing poles that are 9 or 10 meters long. So that's about 30 feet. So that's pretty close to a half wavelength on 20 meters. So if you had a couple of radials going along your balcony and you had one of these poles, you could just run a wire up to it. You could even only have it up when you're on the air so that people don't see it when you're not. Then that will be close to a quarter wavelength on 7 megahertz and a half wavelength on 14 megahertz. And it will tune up on various bands in between as well. So that is a possible option if you don't have enough room for a horizontal wire.
What would you say? You're a big fan of magnetic resonant loops. What would you say about something like that on a balcony?
Yeah, possibly. They do have a null, so if you've got local noise that's a problem, you can turn them and null that out. However, if you've got a big balcony and you've got room for a vertical or a quarter or half wavelength wire antenna, the wire antenna would probably give you better performance being full-sized. However, having said that, if you take a lot of time and effort with the loop, like ensuring that there's very low DC resistance, using copper or aluminium, using a high-quality variable capacitor without too much contact resistance, you can get good results with a magnetic loop. But it's, I suppose, a bit of a last resort if you're really stuck for space. I would be looking at vertical and horizontal antennas first if you've got the room.
Great advice. Okay, let's get into it. We've got some slides that you brought along. I love this photo. Boy, you come by your passion honestly, don't you, Peter?
Yeah, I probably haven't changed much since then, but anyway. Yeah, that thing was a electric tea stirrer. So that was just when I invented it. Invention is probably stretching things a bit, but anyway, it was just tying a spoon to a motor with batteries. So that was trying to stir something with that. And that was when I was in Western Australia, which is where I spent my childhood, in the backyard then.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Let's talk about some homebrew QRP. What do you want to talk about here?
Well, basically, key message is it's never been cheaper or easier to build QRP equipment than right now. When I started in radio, about 30 years ago, people were quite pessimistic about homebrew QRP. They said that, oh, you wouldn't be able to get the variable capacitors. You wouldn't be able to get the RF final transistors. Crystals, getting them pre-made was expensive. Everything was going synthesized. And so there was a bit of pessimism, I suppose, at the time about the future of not being able to build stuff. But you know what happened? Afterwards, it got cheaper, far cheaper now to build the idea of people building a multi-band HF transceiver in, say, the 1980s. A few people did it, but they were only people that were very, very advanced in their electronic skills, or they had a lot of test equipment. Test equipment was horrendously expensive. Generating a stable frequency was a real struggle, but now it's become so much cheaper and easier. You've got electronic commerce with eBay, being able to buy components. Because at one time you could not buy, at least in Australia, I don't know how it was in the United States, but at one time you had to be basically in the electronics trade to be able to buy specialized components, things like RF transistors, or you had minimum quantities for certain things, which put a lot of construction out beyond the reach of the average amateur. However, all that's electronic commerce has made, eBay has made getting components a lot cheaper. In real terms, it is a lot cheaper to buy transistors than and other components than they used to be. The things that have gone up in price have been more your mechanical type components, like your high quality metal boxes, vernier reduction drives, variable capacitors. They might be a bit harder to find unless you've got a good hamfest. But overall, you've had, it's much easier for the average amateur to be building something now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So if you want to start off with building something, you can start off, even if it's just a transmitter. You've now got web-controlled receivers all around the world. And if you pick one that's like 300 or 400 miles away and you build a little transmitter for 7 megahertz, even if you don't get a contact on it, you can press the key and hear yourself coming back online from this web-controlled receiver with your little 1 or 2 transistor transmitter. You can buy crystals for frequencies like 7023 very cheaply, which are in the amateur band. You can even, for American amateurs, you can put a low value of capacitance in series with it and get it just above 7025. So if you're restricted with a general or a technician, because 7023 isn't quite in your band, you can pull it up a little bit and get it just in your band there. So there's all these techniques like that. You've got a lot of information is available online, and of course YouTube videos, websites. So it's also a lot easier to get information. And there's also groups, like whether it's Facebook or email groups, that can help people if you get stuck. So it's been a lot easier to get information, to get components, and to get help if you get stuck than it ever has been, compared to 30 or 40 years ago. So much easier to build equipment now than it used to be. You've got activity like Parks on the Air, POTA, SOTA, so you can get some really good contacts with homebrew QRP gear. So that's the main message. Basically, if you've ever been wanting to build homebrew gear, then it's much easier now and much cheaper now than it ever has been.
All right. You are the guy for, as far as I'm concerned, for pedestrian portable. This is, you've done so much of this. You've worked with so many different types of antennas and gear. What wisdom can you share with us on this?
Okay, basically, be simple, be cheap, but not too cheap. There's a bit of a happy medium. You don't want to take something that won't get you contacts. On the other hand, you don't want to take everything and the kitchen sink. A lot of people reckon they need to take a lot, bring everything, and they really don't need to. There's a happy medium. In this case, I think that I've covered this a bit on my website. I talk about it in my minimum QRP book, but you basically, there's certain frequencies that on bands that are easy to get contacts, like 40 meters, I find very easy to get contacts. There's a lot of people on 40 meters. Often when you call CQ, you can often get people coming back. There's a lot of parks activity, whereas there's bands like 28 megahertz that can be great at certain times when it's open, but it might not be as easy to get contacts. And bands like 14 megahertz, at least in Australia, where a lot of people might be working DX, you can sometimes get good contacts, but not all the time. So it's important to pick your band and frequency right. You need to think about operating modes. CW is very good, but you can do surprisingly well on SSB. Operating antennas, if you can, take a full-sized antenna. If we go back to the picture that there was just me sitting there, if we go back to that, I'll go through the station. Can we go back to the previous? Yeah, the portable HF QRP setup. So there, I'm short walk from home. That's all I've taken. So the antenna wire is 20 meters long. I find 20 meters long is a good length. It's an end-fed wire. People talk about resonant antennas being necessary. I've not found that to be the case. The ATU is just a little L match, just a variable capacitor and a switched coil with various inductances. With that, I can cover all bands from 7 megahertz to 28 megahertz just with that setup. And I have an end-fed. The 9-meter pole is, you can just, if you're in an area with lots of trees, then you could just take fishing line and a sinker and throw that over a tree. But I'm a bit lazy with that. And also, if I'm near the beach, there's not going to be very many tall trees. So a 9-meter pole is really good. And there's me on the right where I'm just carrying it, just walking down to the beach. And as far as transceivers go, there's not much difference. If you've got a basic good 5-watt transceiver, there's not a lot of difference between something like an FT817 and one that's more expensive, like the Elecrafts or the ICOPs. They're great receivers. They've got good RF performance. They might have a bit more power, but overall, provided you've got more than a couple of watts, frequency agility is very important. Some people start with those very simple Pixie transmitter kits or transceiver kits, and yes, you can make contacts with them, but you need a station that's good enough to be able to make random contacts. Most of your operating will be tuning around, trying to find a station that is finishing a contact, or maybe there's someone calling CQ that you want to respond to. And for both those, you need to be frequency agile. So that's where you don't compromise. Frequency agility is absolutely king. Once you've got frequency agile, sufficient power, like at least 2 watts, maybe 5 watts, then you can have lots of contacts. And that's both for SSB and CW and no doubt digital modes. So yeah, as pictured, that's what I take most of the time. Although sometimes when I'm trying antennas, I might take a bit more.
Very good. Yeah, there's a great advice in there. All right.
Hey, Peter, I had a question come to mind though. When you're setting up those that wire antenna, are you using any kind of a ground or counterpoise, or just putting it into the ATU?
I do usually use maybe 1 or 2 meters of wire as a small counterpoise,
Sure.
And that's where counterpoise is quite important, because you can get away with that if you're using the antenna as a half wavelength. Whereas if I was to use that setup with the 20 meters of wire on 80 meters, it would only be a quarter wavelength, and it would be very inefficient with a small counterpoise. But if you've got something like a jetty or that's metal or a metal fence, you could take a clip and clip onto that. Another possibility you could experiment with is a ground tuning unit and have a wire so you can resonate your ground system. That is a approach that I know that Dave G4AKC, who is very well known for operating on 20 meters as a portable setup, he does that very well. And by operating near the salt water, he can,
Right.
I'm not sure if he's coupling into the water, but anyway, there's a very good ground system with the ground tuning unit. So that is a possibility if you aren't able to set up a big radial system. But for bands like 80, 160 meters, especially if your antenna wire is very short, then you do need to pay attention to that.
Good.
All right, let's talk about some locations for long haul DX, QRP style.
Okay, well, on the left is me at my local beach where I'm about to set up probably a vertical antenna. I might use a radial. I might be using a ground tuning unit or a radial along the ground, and it helps if the nearer the salt water, the better. There's a very big uplift in your signal if you can be within, I think it's something like a third of a wavelength or quarter of a wavelength. Anyway, it's only a few meters. So that can be a problem if you're in an area where you've got big tides where the water can go in and out a long way, and it might end up wetting yourself and your equipment. But luckily where I am, it's a bay beach, so the tide isn't too bad. So you set up reasonably close to there, and the thing I've hammered in is just a metal stake, and then I will use some Velcro strap and attach the squid pole. So that could work for, I could use either that as a support for a vertical or an end-fed inverted V if I have a full wavelength of wire. Or it could even be if I have two of those poles and two of those stakes, then a really good antenna would be, as I described before, a half square antenna, effectively two verticals in phase. And if you have it in the right direction, it's also, it helps if the water is in the direction that you wish to travel. And that can depend on whether you are seeking long path or short path. Here in Australia, if we're trying to work Europe on 20 meters, long path is often successful. But where I am in the photo on the left, my coast is facing west. So that's good for making contacts with South Australia, which is to the west, and Western Australia. But for Europe, long path, it's not so good. And so that's where the photo in the right, where I'm in a bit of a swamp. Luckily, I'm in a location where I'm a very short walk to either the beach or the swamp. So on the right, I'm in the swamp, and that's where I've got two masts set up, and I'm using a half square antenna, and that's favoring the direction towards Europe. And the bit of aluminium foil is actually aluminium foil with book covering, and that is a bit of a ground where I've got a ground tuning unit, and I've got that as the counterpoise. So I've got these two verticals in phase with the counterpoise, and I've had great results on 20 meters. I've gone down to 5 watts. I've easily been able to work DX, the Europeans, on 20 meters. I've got a video where I've gone down to, I think, a few, like 100 milliwatts, where I've worked G4AKC, who's also been portable on 20 meters. So I've got some videos on that. And that's where, although it's not salt water, it's wetlands. And the other thing is, even if you can go a few hundred meters away from suburbia, and that's only, I'm probably only about 300 or 400 meters away from houses, that makes a big difference to the amount of noise that you are receiving. And there's whole layers of signals that you might not know exist if you're at home. Like if you're at home with all the noise of suburbia, you might only be hearing the people running kilowatts and say 8-element log periodics. But when you go portable, you start to hear all these other people that you might not necessarily be able to hear at home. And they might not hear you, but if they are operating from portable locations and they also have low noise, then yes, they might hear you. So there's an opportunity for portable operating that helps if you've got a low noise level, and the location really helps there. In the picture on the top right is just me at a local pier a little bit further down the coast, and I'm just using a fishing pole to set up a vertical. and it's a benefit that the railing is metal, so I can clip my earth to. So, yeah, that's another possibility.
Perfect. Nice.
Who's taking the pictures?
That's the camera where I've just set it up on video on a tripod. A lot of the pictures are taken just on a very short tripod. So yeah, I've just pasted the video. So I've just
all right. Here we go. And this is something that I, in my mind, you are really known for, and that's the whole concept of pedestrian mobile.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun, especially in the warmer months. There's two main antennas that I use. On the top left is a magnetic loop. That's the biggest magnetic loop I've got. It's about 3 feet in diameter, and that can cover all bands from 7 through to 28 megahertz. So I've had good contacts on 7 megahertz. The furthest I've had on 7 megahertz is about 2,500 kilometers, which is to New Zealand. I've also worked Western Australia, which is a similar distance. Of course, the antenna efficiency isn't all that great, but you can still get some great contacts. I've worked into the United States with that on 20 meters SSB. I've worked into Europe. I've got some videos on my YouTube channel where I've demonstrated contacts there. And I've been near the beach because in this case, that beach is favorable for the United States long path. On the bottom left is a smaller loop. That one only does 21 through to 50 megahertz. That's what I call the summer loop because it's most often used for sporadic E when you've got really good conditions on 10 and 6 meters. Signals are really strong, so you can have some good contacts with that. And that's just where I've just walked down to the beach. I've got the FT817 in an over-the-shoulder bag. And although I have worked Europe on that antenna as well on 10 meters during the last sunspot peak. So you can get some good DX with that. In the middle and the right is what I call the RAID antenna, and that's a vertical antenna. It's 5 meters tall. In the bag is, I've got 2 bags. There's one little bag that has the FT817. The big bag is a backpack that you can see on the photo on the right. And I'm using a 5 meter long fishing pole with a wire going up it. There's a loading coil in the middle that I only use for 7 megahertz. But otherwise, that is a quarter wavelength on 14 megahertz and a half wavelength on 28 megahertz. And with the L-match antenna coupler, I can operate on all bands from 7 through to 50 megahertz. And I've had contacts all over the world with this setup while operating pedestrian mobile. It really helps if you're standing in the salt water. So you can see in the middle picture, I'm putting on a ankle thing, which is basically a ring of aluminium, and is the earth or the counterpoise that connects the antenna coupler. So I have to be in ankle to knee deep water. As soon as I get out of the water, then the signals drop hugely. It might drop by 4 or 4 S points, and I've done demonstrations of that. However, if you are inland and you don't have salt water, then that's okay. You can have a trailing counterpoise, which is like 5 meters of wire. That's a quarter wavelength on 14 megahertz. You can do that. And I've still worked Europe with that while walking along on 20 meters SSB. So being near salt water is good, but not necessary to work DX. And that's called the RAID tenor. And I've described it in my books and on my website, and there's some videos as well.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
And there's a very simple one as well that I've called the RAID tenor DX. That's very similar, but it's got no loading coil. There's also no variable inductor. I've found that with 1 microhenry of inductance in the antenna coupler, with the variable capacitor, I can cover frequencies from 14 through to 28 megahertz. So it gives you a bit of choice.
I am curious, how is that pole anchored in the backpack? So that
I use a plastic chopping board, and you can buy them from a supermarket, or you can get them from a charity shop. So a kitchen chopping board, and that's like 12 inches by 10 inches. And then I've got a piece of PVC tubing screwed to that, and then the fishing pole, the 5-meter pole, just slips into that tubing, and that's bolted to that. So that's a plate in the backpack, and it keeps it vertical.
You're ingenious. I gotta say that is brilliant. It's simple, it's easy, it's cheap, and it works.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
Fantastic. Okay, hey, you are an accomplished author, Peter. Tell us a little bit about your books.
All right. I've written a few books on amateur radio topics, and you can buy them on Amazon, or there's information about them on my website, VK3YE.com. And there's a total of 8 books there. Ham Radio Gets Started and the Australian Ham Radio Handbook are basically the same book. They're both beginner manuals into amateur radio, except the Australian one is just for within VK. Ham Radio Gets Started, if you're in the United States, if you're interested in getting into ham radio, then buy that book. It's written specifically for American conditions. I also have the American call sign AK3YE. So it's not a study manual. It won't help you pass your tech, your general, or your extra, but it tells you what you need to know to get started in amateur radio. So there's a lot about antennas you can use. There's a lot about various facets of the hobby, how you set up a station, how you get contacts. That's really important. Like, there's a lot of people that might have their tech license but haven't made a contact on the air, or they might have only had a few contacts on the local repeaters, but they haven't necessarily made contacts elsewhere, especially if they're unarranged. So there's a lot of detail there on how to make contacts, and quite a bit on HF as well. Like, if you're a tech ham in the United States, you've got access to, not only VHF, UHF, but also 28 megahertz and 7 megahertz and 21 megahertz. And 7 megahertz CW you can operate, and there's a bit on making contacts with that. The other books are mainly to do with low power amateur radio, minimum QRP. If you are looking at getting into low power radio, then minimum QRP is a good starter guide. So it talks about the equipment, the antennas you need, and what you can achieve. And again, there's a lot of information on making contacts and operating techniques. So it's very heavily an operating manual. There's 2 books, Hand Carried QRP Antennas. That is a lot about very simple antennas, like some of them you've just seen pictured, antennas for portable operating. And by hand carried, I mean that antennas that you can just put in a little bag and get on air, set up in a few minutes and get on air. And some of them are pedestrian mobile as well. So if you're thinking of going on a holiday or summits of the air, parks on the air, then those 2 are good books to have. There's also 99 Things You Can Do with Amateur Radio. That's more for beginners. It talks about various facets of the hobby. And as a reference, there's the Ham Radio Dictionary as well. So if you've ever been puzzled about a term, then you're almost certain to find its meaning in that book. So overall, they're quite low price. You can get them as ebooks for around $5 US, or there's paperback versions as well on Amazon. So that's a summary of books that I've written.
Well, thank you very much for that. You're absolutely prolific. The amount of content that you put out there to encourage, and I'm sure that you've seen. Now, this is hugely important to especially new hams, but maybe people who have, maybe they got burned out. They were appliance operators for years and years, and now all of a sudden, it's like, hey, maybe I want to take a look at the more technical side of things. I want to try something different. This is a gold mine of information. I
think that I'm thinking that introductory book, the one you have, like one for Australia and one for the States, and we had one of our live streams. We talked about different folks that we could attract that might actually have an interest in ham radio as a hobby. And we were talking like the preppers and the GMRS folks and all those folks. And that book actually would probably be a great way to just kind of introduce them to the hobby. It's not to prep you for an exam, but just kind of see what it's all about. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's I've sort of pitched it for that, and it's very much it talks. It's very very US centric. So it
Right.
talks about the ARRL, the organisation, the culture is quite different in the United States. For instance, in the United States, there's a strong emphasis on MCOM that we probably don't have in Australia. So yeah, it's very much written for American conditions as well.
Hey, you got a US call sign.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell me more.
And I was lucky enough to get AK3YE, so you just need to change one letter. We have in Australia, we have VECs, your ARRL VECs in Australia. So I thought, well, it was a bit of fun to do the American exams. So there was a radio club not far from here where I went along and first of all did the tech paper, and so so passed that, and then the general, then the extra. So it was a lot of fun.
So I could get an Australian call sign. I was trying to tell Tracy that we were big in Australia, but he sniped at me for using the royal we. But
well, we are a lot here in Australia. It's a little bit different here. Like we have our own exam system. I don't think that we have exams in the United States, although there might be some online. You may be able to do it online. I'm not sure how it goes. Certainly there's.
So Peter, were the American exams easier or harder?
Overall, I would say they are a little bit harder. The topics are a little bit. One difference is that whereas with the American exams, you combine what we call our regulations and the theory. They're all in the one paper. Whereas in Australia, we have the regulations are in a separate paper to the theory. So if you pass theory and fail regulations, then you don't have you're not qualified. Whereas
so
that's combined.
How do the numbers work there? So if let's say I wanted to be VK9AB or something, we could do like what's Port Moresby or do they?
Port Moresby, New Zealand. In fact, New Guinea used to be VK9 when they were a colony of us. Now they are P29, so they're a separate country. In relation to call signs, it has changed recently, but the general procedure has been if you are a Victorian, then you get a VK3 call sign, and it's like state-based numbering. However, now if I was to move to Sydney or Queensland, then Sydney is considered the VK2 call area, Queensland VK4. If I want, I can get my call sign changed to a VK2 or a VK4, but now I don't have to. So I can remain a VK3 no matter where I move. Your first call sign would typically be issued in the state that you are in. And if you move, then you don't have to change your call sign. Although having said that, the vast majority of amateurs you'll hear, say in New South Wales, are VK2s. There's minor exceptions, but generally speaking, and it's also handy so you know where to point the beam to or whatever.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just had to turn around because I have a VK2 QSL card on the wall.
Oh, okay. Who is he?
VK2 AMB, Alpha Mike Bravo. I don't know.
AMB. Okay.
Yeah.
Peter, we have a question.
Okay, there's a question about kite antennas. I have used kite antennas. The results have been absolutely amazing, particularly on 160 meters. With a kite antenna, you can get performance equivalent to that of a big station with very little, and you're not having to spend money on towers and it's amazing. However, it can be a bit frustrating depending on your kite. They're probably better. Like there have been times where I've tied the kite to something and it's stayed up for like 40 or 50 minutes. But other times, I would suggest that kite antennas are probably better if you're doing it as a radio club expedition. So you've got someone to operate the radio and someone to look after the kite. There can be cases where there's absolutely no wind and you're disappointed and you can't get anything up. You need to take a lot of line. Apparently, it's best if you have the kite way up with a lot of line and then your wire antenna.
The key on the end.
Yeah, but you can get. The other thing with kite antennas is, if you touch it, then even if it's not a thunderstorm, then if it's cloudy, there's a possibility of getting a zap from it. So you do need to. There's safety precautions. You do need a high value of resistor to short the static down to earth. With kite antennas, they can be amazing. A bit hard to operate on your own, though not impossible. So it's really good if if you've got a group of people there who can help with both the radio and the kite.
Do you make it to the States ever?
Oh, many times. The best time would be 14 megahertz in the morning here. It would be like
No. On a plane.
No.
To the States.
No, I've never actually been.
No? Oh, we got to get him over here.
Yeah, absolutely.
We should bring him to the. We should do the Lake Michigan activation here. We should come over for a week.
It's not salt water. Peter might be bitterly disappointed.
It's a lot colder, but so what?
It's a lot colder. Yes.
You'll have to wear shoes.
We should talk about that. We should talk about that and make a thing out of it. I think it'd be fun. If he's willing.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like it though.
Australia, Lake Michigan. I don't know. I think I know which way I'd go.
I'd go to Australia.
Beats all parts of Australia yet.
Yeah, I'm too worried about getting bit by something, so he'd have to come here.
You have to sell a lot of books to buy that airline ticket.
Okay, listen. There's one question I have to ask you, Peter. Have you ever seen A yowie, B, a bunyip, or 3, a drop bear?
No, unfortunately not. But there's always a time potentially.
Those are cryptids, gentlemen. And of course, cryptozoology is one of my things. But my drop bear may be my favorite cryptid of all. Peter, you're familiar with the drop bear?
Not particularly, no.
Oh, do let me tell you. So there are certain jungles in the north of Australia you don't want to go in because there are koala-looking bears that will drop out of trees and viciously attack people. Look it up. I didn't just make that up. That's actually a thing.
And of course, if you go into the water, then we've got these amazing crocodiles as well that will.
Oh yes.
In
the water, it's over. Sorry. No. Not at all.
All
Do
right,
it in the
good
summer. Do what in the summer?
Come to Lake Michigan.
Yeah, it's so cold.
Don't even think about it in wintertime.
That's right.
Now, do they put salt on the ice there, or is that just on your roads? Like, would that make the ground more conductive?
That's a good question.
Good.
I make this little antenna where I use like a ground anchor on it. So sometimes I'll run a counterpoise, and sometimes I'll just stick a little. And I found the best way to do it is to just use that as an anchor and then run it as a sloper. But very often we'll take some Gatorade or some other material and like pour it in the ground over the ground conductor, and it actually improves. So yes, depends on the kind of salt though that you use. I mean, the salt that we use here for the roads and the sidewalks and stuff like that, you can get everything from regular like rock salt, and they have the pet safe, which is I think like magnesium chloride, and you can get super low temp calcium chloride and calcium chloride aqueous solutions and stuff like that. So you can go crazy with salt. There, my technical minute.
More than you wanted to know about salt.
Exactly. No, that's I'm thinking they put those big the salt on the side of the roads draws the moose out, so that the moose will come in because in the middle of the winter they're salt deprived.
Yeah.
And so the moose, the deer, other wildlife will come out and they'll actually lick up the salt.
Don't you put out salt licks for things like that? I know some places in the country will put out salt licks, and the deer will come and do that.
But that's baiting, isn't it? I'm not a hunter, but
no, I mean not for hunting. I mean, you do that. I mean, some people just like to have deer walking across their property.
Yeah, somebody put salt licks out for them.
Yeah. I don't think you do that with a moose, though. I don't think you want to be anywhere near a moose.
Oh no. There was one guy on 80 meters I was
I'd
listening
rather go
to a
swimming.
few weeks
I'd rather
ago.
go swimming on Peter's Beach than talk to a moose.
Yeah, I'll do that. Let's go.
I listened to an 80-meter net, and there's guys all over Ontario and right up into the north country where there's not a lot of people. There's a whole lot of forest, and a lot of these guys are farmers. And during the winter, they camp out on 80. They're not working. You know, it's like they put in their work year when the weather's good, and they often put out beverages. Well, one of the biggest complaints that I hear on this net is that the moose are walking into the beverages and dragging their wires and pulling them down, and the guys got to go back out and put up another 600 feet of wire.
You know, them and the drop bears.
I'll take a moose over a drop bear. Those sound pretty scary to me. Okay, well, I guess we've come to the end. So thanks very much, Peter. Really do appreciate your taking the time with us. Do you have any parting shots for us as we close this out?
Well, basically, get on air, make contacts, and have fun.
Yeah.
You know what? Just before I let you go, there's another question that's just popped in. Do you want to take a look at this one?
Yeah, antennas analyzer. I do have an analyzer or use calculations, but more often than not, I don't. The L-match antenna coupler looks after a lot of things. I have played around with antenna simulation programs. I think I've done 1 or 2 videos of it. I'm not very original. I copy a lot of other people's designs. But yeah.
Don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I would probably like to do more advanced antennas, but I suppose it's a matter of laziness and practicality, being limited to what you can carry by hand. But maybe, you never know. There's certainly scope, I think, for wire beams in terms of the amount of performance per dollar. Something like a wire beam, or maybe even a bobtail curtain with reflector. I think you could get some quite impressive gain from antennas like those. But location is also extremely important.
Yes.
If I can just make one comment about one of your videos that I thought was an all-time classic, it's when you made the bobtail curtain for 70 centimeters. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Well done. How did it work?
Very well, actually, and it does have a bit of gain. So if you are having problems getting into the repeater, why not make it a club project or a video project, and you can get some better performance, because it's very simple. It's 50 ohm at the impedance, and it could help you get into that distant repeater.
It's small. I mean, it doesn't take up much room. It's incredibly practical. So that was an awesome video. Okay. Thanks very much again, Peter. Hey, Chris, you got any parting shots for us?
Well, actually, I just wanted to thank Peter for it. I feel like I'm talking to a superstar here. This is awesome. And actually, you've convinced me. For the longest time, I was one that said, like, if operating QRP, it's all about the antenna, and do not put anything between the radio and the antenna. But you kind of convinced me to say, I think I'm going to experiment. I have a little LC little tuner box. I might just drag that out there and try noodle around with that. So you've convinced me.
Yeah, I could.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Tracy. And thank you, Tim, as well. And thanks all for watching.
Hey, Tim, anything from you before we quit?
Thanks. See you next summer. See you next summer over here on the lake.
Wouldn't that be something?
It would. We should.
Peter, can you hang around for a few minutes while we debrief afterwards?
I can, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much to everybody who's tuned in. Really appreciate anybody who's watching this after it's been recorded. We really appreciate it. So best DX, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next month.
73.
7-3.